We're at about 30 minutes into the study. Let's actually transition now that I've hit all of those. What we're actually going to be talking about tonight is just like gotquestions.org critiqued the pre-trib, the mid-trib, and the post-trib for their strengths and weaknesses. We're now ready to turn to question. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the pre-wrath view of the rapture? I went back and reviewed their the way they dialogue with their positions, and I realized that they don't actually, except for maybe on one or two of them, like the post-tribbers, they don't actually use the word strength when they're describing their understanding of that position. But they do use the language of weakness. So it's kind of hard to tell what they think is a strength, but it's easy to tell what they think is a weakness. So I'm going to read down through this just like I read the other ones. And just like the other ones, they're not going to tell you what the strength is. You kind of have to deduce it from just listening. But they do definitely tell you what the weaknesses are. And just for frame of reference, there are two very important things I want to tell you, then I'll start. One, this is gotquestions.org. They are pre-trib. I am Ariel Ben Lyman Hanavi. I am Prewrath. If you're going to send me questions and comments in your as you watch this YouTube video or such, don't confuse me with Got Questions, please. I'm not a pre-tribber. I'm a pre-wrather. I get some people that push back on what I'm saying. They're like, well, pre-trib is obviously wrong. Sometimes these are post-tribbers. Pre-trib is obviously wrong because of blah, 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 blah. Why are you teaching pre-trib? I'm like, what? I'm not teaching pre-trib. I'm pre-wrath. So, GodQuestions.org is pre-trib. And I, Tatesei Torah Ministries, the ministry I hold to, Ariel Ben Lyman Hanavi, me, the guy talking to you right now, I'm pre-wrath. We're not the same. Got it? Good. All right, let's read down through this. GodQuestions.org. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the pre-wrath view of the rapture? All right, let's read their answer. And their answer, by the way, again, is nice. It seems to be fairly researched and somewhat accurate as far as I could tell. I went back and critiqued it myself. And what I'm going to do, let me tell you where I'm going with this in case we don't get through all of this. After we read their strengths and weaknesses version, in their answer, there are at least two whole paragraphs given over to what they call weaknesses. And so I've labeled them weakness 1, weakness 2. We're going to see this here in a moment. What I did this week is I put the finishing touches on two essays that I wrote. One is called Prewrath Weakness Number 1. The elect of the Olivet Discourse is the church. And the other is Prewrath Weakness Number 2. The sealed judgments are not the wrath of God. And these are what they think are supposed weaknesses of my position or the pre-wrath position. So in time, I have to get to that and explain it. But let's read what they have to say. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of the pre-wrath view of the rapture? Answer. There are many opinions regarding eschatology. However, eschatology, by the way, is the doctrine of future things. However, almost all Christians agree on these three things. 1, there will be a future time of tribulation. 2, after that time of trouble, Jesus will return to establish his kingdom. And 3, believers will be translated from their mortal state to an immortal one. In other words, there will be a rapture. Read John 14, 1 Corinthians 15, 51 and 52, 1 Thessalonians 4, 16 to 17, etc. They continue. One remaining question is, when will the rapture occur in relation to the tribulation and Christ's second coming? Okay, now let's read this middle part. 3 basic theories concerning the timing of the rapture are pre-tribulationism, which places the rapture before the tribulation, mid-tribulationism, which places the rapture at or near the midpoint of the tribulation, and post-tribulationism, which places the rapture at the end of the tribulation. Somewhat closely related to mid-tribulationism is the belief in a pre-wrath rapture, which is the subject of this article. I don't know why they don't just say that there are 4 theories. I don't like being lumped in with the mid-tribbers. It's not that I have anything against mid-trib, but if you just automatically wave your hand and say, well, there's pre-wrath, but they're basically mid-trib modified, so let's just focus on the 3. I think that does a disservice to the rich research and careful exegetical work that's been put in to explain the position known as pre-wrath. Yes, we're new in name, but we like to believe, just like the other positions, that we're a position that's biblical, which means as far as the theology is concerned, we go all the way back to the New Testament, just like or in fact, we would go all the way back to the Old Testament to the degree that we recognize the themes and parts of rapture or Christ's second coming that are foretold in the Old Testament prophecies. So, yes, the name Prewrath is a new label that came about in the 1990s, Marvin Rosenthal, but this doesn't mean that the position, the theology, and the teachings that are rooted in Scripture are new. They're not a new twist on Scripture. They're actually a very ancient interpretation that, just like the other three, they believe that we're holding to biblical interpretation. So 3 basic theories. All right, let's keep going. This is gotquestions.org. They are pre-trib. I am Ariel Hanavi. I am pre-wrath. This is what gotquestions.org has to say about the strengths and weaknesses of the pre-wrath, the position that I hold to. The pre-wrath rapture theory says that the rapture occurs before the great day of wrath. Revelation 6:17. This would be a statement by the earth dwellers who look up into the sky and see the sky splitting apart and notice that God the Father and the Lamb are making an entry onto earth. At least at that point, the earth dwellers cry out in fear. Whether they realize that God's judgment has been here all along, there's some debate there. However, I do recognize that the earth dwellers at that point are using this word wrath. John records that in Revelation. It's the first time that the Greek word orge, from where we get our English word orgy, right? So that's the similarity between those two words, English to Greek, Greek to English. But orge is used for the first time, and it's one of the words for wrath. It's not the only word for wrath, but it's one of the key words for wrath that's found in the Bible, and this is the first time it shows up. According to the pre-wrath view, this is Got Questions speaking. According to the pre-wrath view, believers go through most of the tribulation, but not the time of God's wrath just before the end of the tribulation. Matthew 24:21. The Matthew 24:21 verse, I want to take a look at that real quick because I want to make sure that they're saying what I think they're saying. So we're fact-checking right now. Matthew 24:21 says here, these are Jesus' words, of course, speaking to his disciples, "For then there will be a great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will again." So, going back to what they are explaining, according to the pre-wrath view, believers will go through most of the tribulation, but not the time of God's wrath, just before the end of the tribulation. Now, the reason I'm trying to be very careful here is pre-tribbers, when I listen to their explanations, when I read their commentaries, when I read their blogs, when I watch their YouTube videos, when I watch their debates with non-pre-tribbers, post-tribbers do what I'm about to explain as well. But pre-tribbers seem to do it quite more frequently than they probably realize. They conflate the term tribulation with the word wrath. So quite frequently, if there's a verse that uses the word for that the English is translated as tribulation, some form of the Greek word thalipsis or something like that, they will translate that as tribulation, but when it comes to the word wrath, often they don't have any problem with finding a verse that has the word wrath, like orge or something else, and they will say this is tribulation. For instance, when I go back over to their main chart, if you notice in the pre-trib rapture, for the entire 7-year time frame, it's labeled prominently in the middle as God's wrath. But you see that the 7 years is broken up into tribulation at the first 3.5 and great tribulation at the second 3.5. But they're still recognized by pre-tribbers as God's wrath / tribulation. Thus, one of the main driving reasons why pre-tribbers hold to the theology that they do is, number one, there are verses in the Bible where God clearly seems to convey to his bride, "You will not suffer my wrath." And this makes sense theologically. And I actually hold to that theology. I don't believe that God needs to punish his bride for the simple fact that Jesus paid the price of the punishment. And in other words, the punishment that was due us was borne by Yeshua. Therefore, we don't need to take the wrath. Jesus took the wrath. He took the wrath of God on our behalf. That makes sense theologically. We don't have to go through eschatological wrath. We're certainly not going to go through final judgment wrath, but we don't even have to go through eschatological wrath because that is reserved for those who are unrepentant. This is a clear theme in the Bible. So I agree with pre-tribbers in the theological aspect they're pushing. But the point I'm trying to highlight here, that's why I'm slowing down a little bit, is because if you conflate the word tribulation with the word wrath, you end up confusing Bible verses. This is my understanding. You end up confusing Bible verses that clearly show that the church must suffer tribulation because of our stance on who Jesus is, because of our stand for righteousness. We must suffer persecution, tribulation, at the hands of evil men, at the hands of antichrist, at the hands of Satan's wrath. We must suffer that, but at the same time, we don't have to suffer God's punishment, because it's a different theological reason driving what wrath is being poured out. Satan, of course, and evil humanity persecutes Christians because they hate truth. They hate God. They hate God's Messiah. They hate God's word. They resist that. They are in darkness and blindness, and therefore they are the enemies of God, and therefore they are going to persecute anyone who's on God's side. That makes sense. Jesus promised that we would suffer this persecution. But at the same time, we don't have to mistake that for God's persecution, because we realize that God is on our side. Why would he punish us? We're his bride. It's Satan who hates us, not God. Right? So my point is, by conflating trib with wrath, we end up with some scriptures that are sorely misunderstood throughout the discussion. So I want you to kind of watch for that. And I'm going to have to highlight some of that because this is a pre-trib website. And I think they're not aware of the need to separate tribulation from wrath theologically. Post-tribbers, unfortunately, make some of these same mistakes. And I wish, and mid-tribbers kind of start to pull away from that. We pre-wrathers are really big on this. It's a major driving logical point that we try to bring up is let's get our terms straight so that we can understand who we're looking at any given verse. And this would, again, it's I know there's disagreement, and you can hear me kind of heated in my voice here, but I'm really trying to push for the idea of clarity, right? So let's just watch for that. The pre-wrath rapture theory says the rapture occurs before the great day of wrath. According to the pre-wrath view, believers go through most of the tribulation. So they just say tribulation, but I wonder, are they talking about the first 3.5 years that they call tribulation that we don't? Or are they talking about the great tribulation, which happens at the midpoint, which we all agree on, right? So remember, when I go back over to this chart, if you look at where the great tribulation, if you look at where the great tribulation is on all four charts, on all four models, the great tribulation starts, let me see if I can poke at it for a second. The great tribulation starts at the second half of the week on all four views. I'm highlighting them for you on my screen so you can see. So in all four views, the great tribulation happens or begins or initiates at the midpoint of the week. All four of us can agree with that. The difference, of course, is either the duration of the Great Tribulation and what's taking place either simultaneously during the Great Tribulation or not taking place simultaneously. If you notice the first three views, reading top to bottom, left to right, pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, all have some form or combination of Great Tribulation that allows for God's wrath to overlap the Great Tribulation. All three of them do. But when you get to the pre-wrath rapture in the lower right corner, that's where we start to say, no, Great Tribulation is one thing. God's wrath is something entirely different. Pay attention to that as we go along. So when the God Questions essay here says that the church will endure Satan's fury and man's persecution, but will be spared God's wrath, I can be on board with that. I'm completely on board with that because it says God's wrath. And notice it says Satan's fury and man's persecution. That to me is a clear delineation between two different types of bad stuff that happens on planet Earth with two different origins, as it were, also with two different purposes. Now, having said that, when I go back to this chart, I do recognize that for the church to go through the Great Tribulation only to be rescued when it comes to God's wrath. Let me zoom in on this one for a second, the pre-wrath rapture. What I do recognize is that when the day of the Lord commences, when we have the day of the Lord start, we still have Israel proper on planet Earth. Israel is God's elect, just like the church is God's elect, but albeit on a different kind of relationship. Israel is God's elect in a temporal sense of the word, and the church is God's elect in this personal and eternal heavenly sense of the word. But both are still God's elect, and Satan persecutes both of us. He goes after the woman, and he goes after the rest of her offspring, Revelation chapter 12. Or just to use the other parts of the Bible in case you're confused about Revelation chapter 12 or disagree with my interpretation on that, then it's safe to say that Jesus tells the disciples in the Olivet Discourse point blank that you'll be persecuted for my name. This means Christians will suffer persecution. We know that's for sure. But the Old Testament passages already told Daniel that the little horn, the beast, will make war with the saints. And from Daniel's perspective, he had no reason to not imagine that it was referring to faithful Israelites at the time when he wrote the word saints. I don't believe Daniel was realizing that some of those verses could actually theologically apply to Christians, which they more certainly do. But we also have to realize that when we're talking about national Israel, there are faithful Israelites that are seeking God's face. They just haven't embraced Yeshua yet, or some have. Either way, they're still Israelites. So what's my point? During the day of the Lord, if you're a believer in Jesus, you should get raptured. That kind of makes sense to me. But in Revelation chapter 7, there's this group that doesn't get raptured, but definitely is recognized as receiving God's protection. Who are they? The 144,000 Jews, 12,000 from each tribe. They seem to still be on earth, which means they suffer. They don't suffer, but they have this protection so that they don't feel the brunt of God's wrath. Likewise, Israel, who went into hiding at the midpoint of the week in Revelation chapter 12, because God told them to flee, and they're a place was prepared for her too. They also are able to escape some of the effects of the tribulation that's poured out by Satan, yet they don't seem to also be suffering under the effects of the day of the Lord. Yet they're still here on planet Earth. So we still have some protection going on for some of Israel who is here on Earth that has not embraced Jesus, but yet also isn't giving in to Satan's whim, so therefore he's persecuting them, etc., etc. We can get into those details later. Let's keep going. We've got about 12 minutes left for me to wrap this part up. What does GotQuestions.org say about the pre-wrath theory, they call it? It is a theory, true. All the other three are theories also, so there's nothing wrong with calling ours a theory. They go on to say that the pre-wrath rapture theory views the trumpet and the bowl judgment in Revelation 7 through 16 as the wrath of God from which the church is exempted, right? Remember 1 Thessalonians 5:9, that famous verse. However, the first 6 seals judgments of Revelation 6 are not considered the wrath of God. This is accurate, according to what we pre-wrathers believe. The GotQuestions.org website is accurately portraying what we believe here. Rather, they go on to say they are viewed as the wrath of Satan or the wrath of the antichrist. And again, this is kind of what I was highlighting earlier. The seals are the precursors to the trumpets and the bowls. The seals are the conditions necessary for the scroll of Revelation to be opened and the contents to be interacted with, either from God's vantage point in heaven or to be the effects to be felt on planet Earth. Jesus is the one who has the authority to open the scroll, therefore he's the one that breaks open the seals. But we're going to learn later on that this doesn't necessarily imply, and it doesn't have to imply, that the seals are Jesus' wrath. But GotQuestions.org continues by saying that this distinction between the seals and the trumpets and the bowls and things like that, this is because there's no direct mention of God's wrath until after the 6th seal is broken in Revelation 6:17, the point I kept highlighting last week. According to the pre-wrath theory, rapture theory, the church will be present to experience the first 6 seals. Now remember, going back over to this slide, the reason this is a problem for the pre-tribbers, which the GotQuestions.org website are pre-tribbers, the reason this is a problem for them is because, in their opinion, the tribulation that they have here at the beginning is underneath God's wrath as well. But the tribulation is confused with originating from God. In the pre-trib model, the 7-year tribulation is God's doing. All of it is God's doing. They believe that the seals that are being opened by Jesus are proof that God is pouring out his punishment on planet Earth. And since the theological foundational principle of God has not destined us to wrath, right? 1 Thessalonians 5:9 must be upheld. Then, if there's going to be any tribulation from God, the church must be raptured pre-tribulationally, from any of this punishment. So really, the name pre-trib is, in my opinion, a bit misleading, because according to the way I understand the difference between tribulation and wrath and why the church must suffer one but be excused from the other, it really would have been better if the pre-tribbers just called themselves pre-wrath, because they're trying to push the point that the church is excused from wrath. They're not so much pushing the point that the church will not suffer persecution. They do believe that the church has and will suffer persecution. That's an accurate point that I also hold to. This doesn't make me a dispensationalist, it just makes me a biblical student. So follow what I'm saying there. But when we get to the pre-wrath position, we no longer have the church going through God's wrath. Instead, we have the church going through the Great Tribulation, but we recognize that this is not wrath of God. This is not punishment from God. Therefore, the church can and must go through that type of suffering, but it's not God punishing us. It's not God taking our lives. That doesn't happen until God's wrath, and even then, it's not God taking our lives. He's punishing wicked humanity, those who have rejected him. So let's go back. So according to pre-wrath rapture theory, the church will be present to experience the first 6 seals. We must. All right, now let's get a little deeper into their commentary. I'm about 7 minutes left. I think I'm going to try and finish this tonight because there's only about 3 or 4 paragraphs. Comparing Revelation 6 with Matthew 24, the pre-wrath rapture theorists identify the first seal judgment with Jesus' description of the end times in Matthew 24, 4-7. This is following on the heels of what they just mentioned earlier about the seals being some type of tribulation that we Christians need to go through. If I were to go to a different slide, let me find one for you that'll kind of show you what I mean by the seals. If we go over to this slide, then we notice that we have all these seals down at the bottom, seals 1 through 5, the 6 seals right here. And the rapture, coming of the Son of Man, date unknown, happens here. So it's a separating. You can even see that these things here are blue. And, I'm sorry, that's kind of messy. Let me get rid of that. These things right here are blue. And the day of the Lord stuff over here is yellow. And what I'm trying to show is that the first 6 seals, or the first 5 seals, so to say. Wow, I didn't mean to do that. Give me a second. Let me erase that. The seals right here that I'm highlighting, these seals represent a kind of tribulation or bad stuff that is a result of either fallen humanity, white plagues, wars, famine, mass death. Antichrist is involved there, but a lot of it can be things that we could even spot happening all throughout human history. The wars, rumors of wars, the famine, the mass death. We've seen these things before, and we don't necessarily blame it on God. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The Bible blames it on us. It's part of our fallen nature. Humans fighting against humans, taking lives indiscriminately, fighting over land, fighting over ideologies, fighting over religion, fighting over resources, things like that. Man's just destroying the earth because he's sinful. God's going to step in and fix all that. The point, however, is that Christians don't need to feel that these things are happening to us either specifically because it's punishment from God, or we don't need to think that these things are happening to planet Earth even specifically because Satan's persecuting Christians. It's not until the Great Tribulation kicks off in the middle there with somewhere around, depending on how you count them, somewhere either around seal 2 or maybe around seal 5, one of those two, depends, that we see this great tribulation that Jesus says is connected to the abomination of desolation here. Wow, that's weird. I didn't mean to do that. But then that's when we can realize that suddenly Satan's heating up his persecution against Christians. He's definitely targeting a group of people that have refused to come on board with his program. Jews and Christians will be primary targets, but really anyone who refuses his mark and refuses to worship him will be target of his particular persecution in that day. So going back over to our essay here, when Got Questions highlights the fact that we pre-wrathers recognize those first few seals as indicative of not God's wrath, but rather bad things that are happening on planet Earth due to wicked humanity, and then ramping up to punishment or wrath from Satan, then we can begin to look at what Jesus said in Matthew 24, as well as the other synoptic accounts of the Olivet Discourse, and realize that when Jesus was talking to his disciples, he was using the language that we're going to later on find in the book of Revelation. We just didn't know it at the time until we got to the book of Revelation, and he actually described them using a symbol of a seal. All right, so that's why we say if it works out, if you compare the seals with what Jesus already gave, there are themes that overlap. I believe that they are actually the same events. It's not just a thematic overlap. They are the same things. What Jesus is saying in Matthew 24 is what he told John in Revelation. I mean, it's the same author, right? It's still Jesus. So Jesus then refers in Matthew to these events as the beginning of birth pains, verse 8. Remember, when we go back over to the slide, the beginning of birth pains would be, let me erase some of all that. It's kind of messy. The beginning of birth pains would be kind of the parts up here. The first, I don't want to overlap that, sorry. It would be starting like this. This would be kind of the beginning of birth pains, starting with the first half of the 7 weeks. So basically the first 3.5 years would be more or less the beginning of birth pains, which gives a way for us to separate the great tribulation from the beginning birth pains, and then a way for us to separate the day of the Lord from the rest, right? The other part, with the rapture, of course, separating all of that, right? So going back to the essay, in Matthew, Jesus gives us this label, the beginning of birth pains. I think that's clear and unmistakable. He doesn't call it the tribulation. He doesn't call it wrath. He says beginning of birth pains. But then in verse 29 and 30, the sign of the Son of Man appears in the sky, and it's at this time, according to we pre-wrathers, that the rapture of the church occurs. All right, now let's jump into, we've got like 3 minutes left. I actually want to jump into this, but I'm going to break off because I don't want to rush through it. They're going to talk about one of the weaknesses of the pre-wrath position, and they're going to say that it is the idea that the elect mentioned in the Olivet Discourse accounts are church-age saints, and they're going to complain about that. And then they're going to show that another flaw in the pre-wrath position is that we believe that the first seal judgments are not the wrath of God, something I kind of took a lot of time going through. And then they're just going to go through, I'm skipping past those for a reason, because I've got answers to them, right? Pre-wrath weakness number 1 and pre-wrath weakness number 2. We'll deal with those next week. But they go on to say that a final weakness, I'll read this, a final weakness of the pre-wrath rapture is shared by the other theories, viz. the Bible does not give an explicit timeline concerning future events. I like this one. This one I'm on board with, right? This is the same thing they said in the other 3 positions. The final weakness of the pre-wrath rapture is the same weakness of all the other positions, that the Bible doesn't give an explicit timeline concerning future events definitively to the point where we can say that this position must be the only position, all the other ones are wrong, even though logically we know that one of them is right and that the others are wrong, or that there's a position that we still haven't recognized yet that's some type of synthesis of all the others, because all of us have truths and all of us have errors. And so to the degree that the truths are accurate, right, that we're right there, then our position at least had some parts right. My point is, I'm respectful of gotquestions.org in that they recognize that everybody is trying their best to present the position that they believe the Bible teaches. At the same time, we all recognize that because of our human weakness and that we don't have full understanding of the text, that we have no right to A, think that we've got the full truth, and B, that we exclusively have it. That meaning that others aren't getting truth. It's very prideful to point out others' errors only as if your position is airtight and error-free. Please don't think that way. You've got to be willing to recognize that your position, just like all the other positions, has strengths and it has weaknesses. Therefore, it has flaws. I'm not saying that you're flawed. I'm not saying that the Bible you're reading is flawed. I'm not going in those directions. I don't believe that the Bible's flawed. But I do believe that we, as humans, just don't have all the truth. We don't understand everything perfectly. Each of us has strengths. Excuse me. Each of us has differing giftings that allow us to interpret the Bible and implement it in different ways that are commensurate with the giftings that the Holy Spirit has chosen to give us. And therefore, we perform our functions in the body according to what the Holy Spirit says that we should be doing. That's right. This is according to Corinthians. Paul explained these giftings that are poured out by the choice of God. It's not our choice to choose our strengths and weaknesses. So some Christians are pretty strong in eschatology and others are a little bit weak. And therefore, when they approach any given rapture theory or discussion, some people have a good way of explaining eschatology and some people don't. And so for those people who don't, maybe they have a good way of explaining something else of the Bible that the eschatology teachers don't have a good handle on. We all have different strengths and different weaknesses. We all approach these topics slightly differently. So in closing for tonight, let me just close with what Got Questions states. Scriptures does not express each one view over the other, and that's why we have diversity of opinion concerning the end times and some variety on how the related prophecies should be harmonized. Again, at the end of the day, in hindsight, once everything is come and gone and we're sitting in the millennial kingdom, we'll be able to go back into the Bible and go, wow, now I can see exactly how this position really is the right position. Of course, hindsight's always 20/20, right? But until that time takes place, at this point of time right now where we're at, where a lot of these events are future, that is, if you're a futurist like me, a lot of these events haven't happened yet. Just have some patience with everyone. Don't throw each other under the bus. Don't be too harsh. Don't divide on issues that don't need to be divided over. Focus on the majors. Major on the majors and minor on the minors. Is Jesus Lord of your life? Are you serving him to the best of your ability? Are you walking in the Spirit? Are you obedient to his words? Are you pointing sinners to repentance? Are you building up the body of believers? Are you walking in forgiveness? Are you saying yes to Yeshua, no to sin? Right? Those are the major things that you need to focus on in your life. You need to get those as priorities. When it comes to eschatology, is it important? You bet it's important. If you don't get eschatology right, you might end up being challenged as to whether or not you should take the mark or not, because you might be confused as to who Antichrist truly is. So yes, study eschatology. It is important. And guess what? If you're an unbeliever, it is vitally important. Because if you don't know who Yeshua is, which is the primary issue, if you don't know who Yeshua is, then when the time comes, you might take the mark. You might not. You might flee and like, no one's going to mark up my body. But you might take the mark because you don't know anything about eschatology. So eschatology is important because what did Jesus say in the book of Revelation? He said the spirit of prophecy is the spirit of Jesus, the spirit of Yeshua. So let's study our Bibles and let's not be too harsh with people who have differences of opinions. We can have discussions, but just do it respectfully, okay? All right. I'll stop here. Next week, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and hit those two supposed weaknesses, right? The weakness of the position that we pre-raptors do say that the elect in Matthew are the church. Pre-tribbers see that as a weakness. And then the other flaw or weakness is that we pre-wrathers teach that the seal judgments are not wrath of God. And pre-wrathers pre-tribbers also, once again, see this as a flaw or weakness. I'm going to address those. I've got two different papers on them. One, weakness number 1. 2, weakness number 2. We'll turn right into those next week. But that'll do it for eschatology, a biblical study of end time events.